5 suitors publicly rejected her, declaring she lacked the qualities to be a true queen. That same night, during a storm that shook the castle, a stranger arrived demanding to speak with her specifically and revealed secrets about her lineage that even her own father didn't know. But if she was just an ordinary human princess, why did the most powerful shapeshifter in the Northern Territories want her as his queen? Isabella's hands trembled as the 5th and final suitor stepped back from the marble throne, his rejection echoing through the grand ballroom like a death sentence. The sapphire silk of her gown, once her pride and joy with its intricate golden embroidery, now felt like a mockery against her burning skin. Each thread seemed to whisper her failure, each jeweled detail a reminder of how thoroughly she had been found wanting. Princess Isabella lacks the necessary qualities to be a true queen, Prince Marcus declared, his voice carrying across the vast hall filled with nobility from across the known lands. The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable carving deeper into her already wounded pride. The scent of jasmine and roses that had filled the air with romantic promise now seemed cloying, suffocating, as if the very flowers were ashamed to be associated with such humiliation. The murmurs began immediately, spreading through the assembled crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Isabella could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her, dissecting her every flaw, cataloguing her failures for future gossip. Her father, King Edmund, sat rigid on his throne, his weathered face a mask of barely controlled disappointment. She had failed him, failed her kingdom, failed herself in the most public way imaginable. The harpists continued their melodic accompaniment, their fingers dancing across strings in blissful ignorance of the catastrophe unfolding before them. The music that had been meant to celebrate her engagement now provided a haunting soundtrack to her complete and utter rejection. Isabella's throat constricted as she fought back tears that threatened to spill down her carefully powdered cheeks. "My lords!" Her father's voice boomed across the suddenly quiet hall, each word measured and heavy with implication. "It appears that no suitable match has been found this evening." The diplomatic phrasing couldn't mask the underlying truth. His daughter was unwanted, unworthy, insufficient in every way that mattered to the political machinery of royal marriages. Isabella rose from her ornate chair beside the throne, her legs unsteady beneath layers of silk and dignity that felt increasingly fragile. The weight of her failure pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden, threatening to crush her beneath its enormity. She curtsied deeply to the assembled nobility, the motion automatic and practiced despite the chaos roiling within her chest. "If you will excuse me," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the suddenly attentive silence. Without waiting for permission or dismissal, she turned and walked toward the grand doors, each step measured and deliberate despite the tempest of emotions threatening to overwhelm her composure. The sound of her satin slippers against the polished marble echoed through the vast space, amplifying her isolation with each footfall. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, more animated, as the assembled nobles began dissecting the evening's events with the enthusiasm of vultures picking clean a carcass. She could imagine their conversations, their speculation about what would become of the rejected princess, their relief that their own daughters had been spared such public humiliation. The corridors of the castle, familiar since childhood, now felt alien and hostile. The stone walls that had once provided comfort and security seemed to close in around her, pressing against her from all sides with their weight of centuries and tradition. Tapestries depicting glorious battles and romantic courtships now appeared to mock her failure, their heroic figures serving as stark reminders of everything she would never achieve. Her private chambers offered little solace when she finally reached them, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind her with a finality that spoke of endings rather than new beginnings. The room that had been her sanctuary, filled with beloved books and personal treasures, now felt like a prison cell where she would await whatever fate her father deemed appropriate for a daughter who had proven herself unmarriageable. Isabella collapsed onto her bed, the sapphire gown spreading around her like the petals of a dying flower. The tears she had held back throughout the ordeal finally came, hot and bitter against her flushed cheeks. Each sob tore through her chest with a ferocity that surprised her, as if all the pain and disappointment she had carried throughout her 22 years was finally demanding its due. The next 3 days passed in a blur of shame and isolation. Isabella refused most meals, picking at delicate pastries and exotic fruits that tasted like ash in her mouth. She dismissed her ladies-in-waiting, preferring solitude to the pitying glances and careful words they offered. The castle continued its daily rhythms around her, but she felt disconnected from it all, as if she had become a ghost haunting her own life. Her father visited once, his expression a mixture of disappointment and reluctant sympathy. "Perhaps it is for the best," he had said, though his words lacked conviction. "The right match will present itself in time." But Isabella could see the doubt in his eyes, the growing realization that his daughter might indeed be destined for spinsterhood, and the political irrelevance that accompanied it. The storm that began on the third evening seemed to echo Isabella's internal turmoil. Rain lashed against the diamond-paned windows of her chambers, while thunder rumbled overhead like the angry voices of disappointed gods. She stood at her window, watching lightning illuminate the courtyard below in stark, dramatic flashes that revealed the ancient stones slick with water and shadow. It was during one such illumination that she first saw the rider approaching the main gates. Even through the driving rain and at such distance, there was something commanding about his presence. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with purpose through the storm, seemingly unbothered by the elements that had sent everyone else scurrying for shelter. The rider wore a dark cloak that billowed behind him like wings, and even from her elevated position, Isabella could sense an aura of power that set him apart from ordinary travelers. Something about his approach stirred a curiosity that had been dormant since her public humiliation, a spark of interest that surprised her with its intensity. She watched as the gates opened to admit him, noting how even the usually stalwart guards seemed to step back deferentially. The way he dismounted spoke of fluid strength and absolute confidence, qualities that seemed as natural to him as breathing. When he handed his horse's reins to a stable boy, the gesture was accompanied by what appeared to be quiet instructions, his attention to the animal's welfare suggesting a character trait that resonated with something deep in Isabella's observant nature. The mysterious arrival disappeared into the castle's main entrance, leaving Isabella with more questions than answers. Who was he? What brought him to their remote kingdom during such a violent storm? And why did his presence seem to charge the very air with anticipation, as if the night itself was holding its breath in expectation of momentous events? She remained at the window long after he had vanished from sight, her mind racing with possibilities. The storm continued its assault on the ancient stones, but she no longer heard it as purely destructive. Now it seemed like a herald, announcing the arrival of something that would change everything she thought she knew about her carefully ordered world. The candles in her chamber flickered in the drafts that found their way through even the most secure castle walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of secrets and hidden truths. Isabella found herself pacing her chambers, unable to settle into any activity that might distract her from the growing certainty that this night marked a turning point in her story. Her reflection in the polished silver mirror showed a young woman whose recent trials had carved new depth into familiar features. The softness of childhood had given way to sharper angles and more defined cheekbones, while her green eyes held shadows that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Her auburn hair, usually styled in elaborate court fashion, hung loose around her shoulders in waves that caught the candlelight and threw it back in shimmers of copper and gold. She looked, she realized, like someone who had been tested and emerged changed by the experience. The rejected princess of 3 days ago seemed like a different person entirely, as if the public humiliation had burned away everything superficial and left behind something more essential and true. A sharp knock at her chamber door interrupted these reflections, causing her heart to leap with sudden anticipation. A page entered at her bidding, his young face flushed with excitement and the importance of his message. "Your Highness," he began, practically vibrating with the significance of his news, "the king requests your immediate presence in the Great Hall. There is a visitor who has specifically asked to meet with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like the first breath after nearly drowning. After 3 days of believing herself invisible and irrelevant, someone had come specifically seeking her presence. "Did this visitor give his name?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "No, Your Highness. He said only that he had traveled far to make your acquaintance, and that his business could wait for no one else." Isabella nodded, dismissing the page with a gesture that surprised her with its newfound authority. As she prepared to face whatever awaited her in the Great Hall, she felt the last vestiges of the humiliated princess falling away like a discarded cloak. Something new was taking its place, something stronger and more resilient than anything she had been before. The sapphire gown she chose for this encounter was simpler than her ball attire, but it complemented her coloring perfectly and moved with her naturally. As she made her way through corridors that now seemed charged with possibility rather than memory, Isabella felt the first stirrings of hope she had experienced since that terrible night 3 days ago. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her in the Great Hall, or for the way her entire understanding of the world would shift when she finally came face to face with the mysterious stranger who had ridden through a storm specifically to find her. The night that had begun with lightning and thunder was about to reveal secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about destiny, desire, and her own true nature. The heavy doors to the Great Hall stood before her like a threshold between her old life and whatever lay beyond. And as she reached for the handles, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that there would be no returning to the woman she had been just moments before. The Great Hall had never felt so vast or so charged with anticipation as Isabella stepped through the towering doors. Every torch seemed to burn brighter, every shadow deeper, as if the very air was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Her father sat upon his throne with an expression she had rarely seen before, a mixture of wariness and intrigue that spoke of negotiations beyond her understanding. But it was the figure standing before the throne that commanded every particle of her attention. He had removed his storm-soaked cloak, revealing a man whose presence dominated the enormous space as completely as if he were a force of nature himself. His dark hair gleamed in the torchlight, slightly damp from the rain but perfectly controlled, framing a face that seemed carved from marble by a master sculptor who understood both strength and beauty. When he turned to face her approach, Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. His eyes were unlike anything she had ever seen, a golden amber that seemed to hold flecks of actual light, as if tiny flames danced within their depths. They fixed upon her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected, as though he could see straight through to her soul, but found nothing there that displeased him. His skin held the warm bronze of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, marked here and there with scars that spoke of battles and adventures far beyond the sheltered walls of castle life. Broad shoulders filled out a black leather jerkin with casual elegance, while his stance suggested coiled power held in perfect check, like a predator comfortable in his dominance but choosing restraint. "Your Majesty," his voice rumbled through the hall with a depth that seemed to vibrate in Isabella's bones. "May I present Princess Isabella?" The formal words seemed almost absurd, given the electricity crackling in the air between them. Isabella felt as though she was seeing clearly for the first time in her life, every detail of the scene etched with supernatural clarity. The way candlelight played across the stranger's angular cheekbones, the subtle flecks of powerful muscles beneath his clothing as he moved, the almost predatory grace with which he carried himself. "Your Highness," he continued, and she realized with a start that he was addressing her directly now. "I am Darius Blackthorn, Alpha and Sovereign Ruler of the Northern Mountain Clans." He executed a bow that managed to be respectful without suggesting subservience, his golden eyes never leaving her face. "I have traveled far to make a proposal that concerns your future." The words hit Isabella like a physical force. After 3 days of believing herself unwanted and unmarriageable, here stood a man whose very presence commanded respect, speaking of proposals and futures with a certainty that made her previous suitors seem like foolish boys playing at being men. "The Northern Mountain Clans," her father said carefully, his political instincts clearly engaged, despite his obvious fascination with their unexpected visitor. "Your reputation precedes you, Lord Blackthorn. Tales of your people's strength and wealth have reached even our remote kingdom." Darius inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the comment without false modesty. "We prefer to let our actions speak rather than our words, Your Majesty. But I come before you tonight because actions alone cannot accomplish what I seek." Isabella found her voice, though it seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. "And what exactly do you seek, Lord Blackthorn?" When those amber eyes focused on her completely, she felt a shock of recognition that made no logical sense. It was as if some part of her had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment, this precise meeting of gazes that seemed to communicate far more than words ever could. "I seek your hand in marriage, Princess Isabella," he said with a directness that left no room for misinterpretation. "I offer an alliance between our peoples, protection for your kingdom, and wealth beyond your current imagination. But more than that, I offer you a life where your true nature will not only be accepted, but celebrated." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of torches and the distant rumble of thunder still echoing outside. Isabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not physically but in every other way that mattered. Here was a man who spoke of her true nature as if he already knew what it was, who looked at her as if she were precious rather than disappointing. "My true nature?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the attentive quiet of the great hall. Darius stepped closer, and she caught his scent for the first time, something wild and clean, like mountain air and forest pine, with an underlying warmth that spoke of safety and strength combined. "You have always felt different, haven't you, Princess? As if the life you were born into didn't quite fit the shape of who you really are." The accuracy of his observation stole her breath away. How could this stranger, this man she had never met, understand something about her that she had barely acknowledged to herself? The restlessness that had plagued her since childhood, the way she preferred books to court politics, her inexplicable connection to the natural world, beyond the castle walls. "I don't understand," she managed, though part of her was beginning to suspect that she understood far more than she wanted to admit. "Then perhaps we might speak privately," Darius suggested, though his tone made it clear that this was not merely a request. "There are things about your heritage, about your bloodline, that you have not been told." King Edmund shifted uncomfortably on his throne, and Isabella saw something flicker across his weathered features that looked suspiciously like guilt. "What do you know of my daughter's heritage?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "I know that her great-grandmother was born in my lands, that she carried the blood of my people when she married into your royal line," Darius replied evenly. "I know that certain traits skip generations but never truly disappear. And I know that Princess Isabella has felt the pull of something beyond these stone walls her entire life." The revelation hit Isabella like lightning, illuminating connections she had never thought to make. Her great-grandmother, whose portrait hung in the castle's portrait gallery, but about whom little was ever spoken. The woman with the same green eyes and auburn hair, whose expression in the painted image had always seemed to hold secrets. "That's impossible," King Edmund protested, but his words carried no conviction. "Those records were lost decades ago." "Not lost, Your Majesty. Simply kept by people who valued the truth more than convenience." Darius turned back to Isabella, and she saw something in his expression that looked almost like tenderness. "Your ancestors were shapeshifters, Princess. They could take the form of wolves when the moon was full, could communicate with the natural world in ways that ordinary humans never could." The words should have sounded insane, should have sent her running from the Great Hall in terror or disbelief. Instead, they resonated through her entire being like a bell struck in perfect pitch. Every strange dream she had ever experienced, every moment when she had felt more connected to the wind and rain than to the people around her, every inexplicable instinct that had guided her through difficult situations. "Show her," King Edmund said suddenly, his voice heavy with resignation. "If you speak the truth about her heritage, then show her what she is meant to become." Darius nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Isabella's face. "Are you prepared to see something that will change your understanding of everything you thought you knew about the world?" Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin with a courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I have spent my entire life feeling as though I was missing some crucial piece of myself. If you can provide that piece, then yes, show me." What happened next would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. Darius stepped back into a shaft of moonlight that streamed through the Great Hall's tall windows, and as Isabella watched in fascination rather than fear, his human form began to shift and change. It wasn't a violent transformation, nothing like the terrifying tales of cursed creatures she had read in ancient texts. Instead, it was fluid and natural, like watching a flower bloom or a river change course. His bones lengthened and reformed without apparent pain, his skin taking on a coating of thick, dark fur that gleamed like silk in the torchlight. His face elongated into a wolf's muzzle, but those incredible amber eyes remained exactly the same, holding all the intelligence and warmth she had seen in his human form. When the transformation was complete, a magnificent creature stood before her, easily the size of a small horse, but moving with the grace of something born to run free beneath the stars. Isabella found herself stepping forward rather than backing away, her hand extended toward the beautiful creature who had moments before been speaking to her in perfectly civilized tones. When her fingers made contact with the soft fur of his muzzle, she felt a shock of connection that ran all the way to her toes, as if touching him had completed some circuit that had been incomplete her entire life. The wolf that was Darius leaned into her touch, a rumbling sound of contentment emerging from his throat that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. In that moment, Isabella understood with crystalline clarity that she was looking at her destiny, at the answer to every question she had ever asked about where she belonged and who she was meant to be. The transformation back to human form was just as smooth and natural as the first change had been. Within moments, Darius stood before her again in his human shape, though now she could see the wolf in every line of his body, in the fluid way he moved, and the predatory awareness in his golden eyes. "Your people," she whispered, her hand still tingling from the contact with his wolf form. "They can all do this." "All of us carry the gift," he confirmed, his voice rougher now, as if the transformation had affected his vocal cords. "We live by the cycles of the moon, by the ancient laws of pack and territory. We protect what is ours, and we mate for life." The word mate hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Isabella's pulse race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. She had read enough to understand that the mating customs of wolves were different from the political marriages of human royalty, based on instinct and compatibility rather than treaties and dowries. "If I were to accept your proposal," she said carefully, testing the words on her tongue, "what would that mean exactly?" Darius smiled, and she saw the flash of teeth that were perhaps slightly sharper than they had been in his fully human form. "It would mean leaving behind the life you have always known and embracing one that honors the wildness in your blood. It would mean learning to hunt and track, to navigate by the stars, to communicate with the natural world in ways your current education never taught you." The prospect should have terrified her. Instead, Isabella felt a surge of excitement so intense it made her dizzy. Everything he described sounded like adventures she had dreamed of but never thought possible, experiences that would challenge and fulfill her in ways that royal court life never could. "And the political aspects," King Edmund interjected, though he sounded more resigned than curious. "What alliance do you offer in exchange for my daughter's hand?" "Protection from the threats you don't yet know exist," Darius replied without taking his gaze from Isabella. "Military support when you need it, access to mineral wealth from the mountain mines, and trade routes that will bring prosperity to your people for generations to come." It was a generous offer, more than generous. Isabella could see her father calculating the benefits, weighing political advantage against the strangeness of the proposed match. But she found that she cared less about the political implications than about the promise she saw in Darius's golden eyes, the suggestion that with him she might finally discover who she was meant to be. "I need time to think," she said finally, though every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to accept immediately, to throw caution to the wind and embrace this incredible opportunity for transformation. "Of course," Darius agreed, though she thought she detected a flicker of disappointment in his expression. "But know this, Princess Isabella, the offer I make is not one I would extend to any other woman in any other kingdom. There is something about you, something that calls to the wolf in my blood, that tells me you are meant to be mine." The possessive note in his voice should have offended her, should have triggered all her carefully instilled lessons about feminine independence and royal dignity. Instead, it sent a thrill through her that she was entirely unprepared to analyze or understand. As Darius bowed formally to her father and prepared to take his leave, Isabella felt panic rise in her throat. "Where will you stay while I consider your proposal?" "There is an inn in your village that will suffice for a few days," he replied, though his tone suggested that he was not accustomed to staying in common lodgings. "But I cannot wait indefinitely, Princess. My people expect their alpha to return, and there are responsibilities I cannot abandon for long." Isabella nodded, understanding the implicit deadline in his words. This was not a decision she could postpone indefinitely, not a choice she could avoid making. Either she would find the courage to embrace the incredible possibility he offered, or she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. As the great hall emptied and she made her way back to her chambers, Isabella's mind raced with everything she had learned. The portrait of her great-grandmother seemed different now, the painted eyes holding secrets that were no longer mysteries. The restlessness that had plagued her for years suddenly made perfect sense, as did her instinctive connection to the natural world beyond the castle walls. She was half wolf, descended from shapeshifters who had once run free beneath the moon. And somewhere in the village below, a man who could become a magnificent predator was waiting for her answer, offering her a chance to discover what it meant to embrace the wildness that had always lived in her blood. The storm outside was finally beginning to abate, but Isabella knew that the real tempest was just beginning. Everything she had thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world, had been turned upside down in a single evening. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whether she had the courage to step into the unknown and claim the destiny that was calling to her, with a voice as old as moonlight and as compelling as her own heartbeat. Isabella barely slept that night, her mind churning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw golden amber staring back at her, felt the phantom touch of soft fur beneath her fingertips, heard the rumbling contentment of a creature who had recognized her as surely as she had recognized him. The rational part of her mind insisted that everything she had witnessed was impossible, but the deeper, more instinctive part of her being thrummed with recognition and awakening desire. She rose before dawn and made her way to the highest tower of the castle, seeking the solitude and perspective that had always helped her think clearly. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean with the scent of rain-washed earth and growing things. From her elevated position, she could see the village below just beginning to stir with the activities of a new day. And somewhere among those thatched roofs and cobblestone streets, Darius was waiting for her answer. The portrait gallery called to her after breakfast, and she found herself standing before the painting of her great-grandmother with new eyes. Lady Evangeline Ashworth had been beautiful in an unconventional way, her auburn hair cascading in wild waves that suggested she cared little for the elaborate court styles of her era. But it was her eyes that held Isabella transfixed now. The same green shade as her own, but holding depths and secrets that spoke of knowledge beyond the merely human. She was magnificent, a familiar voice said behind her, and Isabella turned to find Darius standing in the doorway to the gallery. He had somehow gained access to the castle without being announced, moving with the silent grace of a predator through supposedly secure corridors. "How did you get in here?" she asked, though she found she was more curious than alarmed by his presence. "Your guards are trained to watch for human threats," he replied with a slight smile that revealed those subtly sharpened canines. "They have no idea how to detect someone who can become shadow and mist when the need arises." The implication that he possessed abilities beyond even what she had witnessed the night before sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with fear. "Tell me about her," she said, turning back to the portrait. "Tell me about Lady Evangeline." Darius moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and catch that wild, clean scent that seemed to be his alone. "She was alpha female of the Mountain Rose Pack before she married your great-grandfather. The political marriage was meant to unite our peoples, but she gave up everything she was to become human royalty." "Did she regret it?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "She lived a comfortable life, bore children who would become your ancestors, fulfilled her duties as a royal wife and mother," Darius said carefully. "But the servants who knew her best whispered that she would spend hours staring out at the mountains, and that sometimes, on the night of the full moon, she would disappear from her chambers until dawn." The image painted by his words made Isabella's chest ache with sympathetic longing. A wild creature trying to content herself with a cage, no matter how gilded or comfortable it might be. "Is that what you're offering me? A chance to choose differently than she did?" "I'm offering you the chance to choose at all," Darius replied, turning to face her fully. "Lady Evangeline had no choice in her marriage, no voice in her fate. You do." Isabella met his gaze, seeing herself reflected in those golden depths, like a woman she had never been but might yet become. "If I accepted your proposal, would I ever be able to return to this life? To visit my family, my father?" Something flickered across his features, an emotion too complex to read easily. "The transformation I offer is not easily reversed, Isabella. Once you embrace your wolf nature fully, the human world will feel foreign to you. You could visit, certainly, but you would find it difficult to pretend to be something you are no longer." The honesty of his answer, while difficult to hear, only increased her respect for him. Another man might have offered false promises or glossed over the sacrifices required. Darius presented the truth without embellishment, allowing her to make her choice with full knowledge of what it would cost. "Show me," she said suddenly, the words emerging before her conscious mind had fully formed the thought. "Not here, not in the castle. Show me what my life would be like if I chose your world. His eyebrows rose slightly, surprise and something that might have been approval crossing his handsome features. "You want to come to the mountains? To see how my people live? For a day," she clarified, though even as she spoke, she suspected that a single day would not be nearly enough to satisfy her curiosity. "I need to understand what I would be choosing, not just hear descriptions of it." Darius was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel transparent. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. But you must understand that once you set foot in our territory, once you breathe our air and feel our earth beneath your feet, the choice will become much more difficult to walk away from." "Why?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because your wolf will recognize home," he said simply, "and once she wakes fully, she will not want to go back to sleep." The promise and threat contained in his words sent shivers down Isabella's spine, but she found herself nodding agreement nonetheless. She had spent 22 years being the dutiful princess, the obedient daughter, the proper lady who never took risks or challenged expectations. Perhaps it was time to discover what lay beyond the boundaries of that careful existence. They left the castle within the hour, Isabella having informed her father that she wished to ride out to consider Darius's proposal in the peace of the countryside. It wasn't precisely a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. King Edmund had looked concerned, but agreed to allow her the space to think, though he insisted she take a small escort of guards. Darius had merely smiled at this precaution, and Isabella understood why when they reached the edge of the royal forest. With a gesture so subtle she almost missed it, he signaled to shadows among the trees that resolved themselves into figures she hadn't noticed before. His own guards, she realized, who had been watching over her even before she knew she needed protection. "How long have you been watching me?" she asked as they rode deeper into the woodland, following paths that seemed to shift and change based on his guidance rather than any earthly landmarks. "Since your 18th birthday," he replied without apparent embarrassment at the admission. "Your wolf scent became detectable then, though it was still faint enough that you probably weren't aware of it yourself. 4 years. He had been aware of her existence, watching over her from a distance for 4 years. The knowledge should have disturbed her, but instead, it filled her with a strange sense of having been cherished, without knowing it, protected by someone who valued her safety above his own convenience. The journey to the mountains took most of the day, though Isabella suspected that normal travel would have required much longer. Darius seemed to know shortcuts that existed outside normal geography, paths that led through groves that shouldn't have been accessible from where they started, and over streams that appeared and disappeared like tricks of light and shadow. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Isabella began to notice changes in herself that both thrilled and unnerved her. Her senses seemed sharper, more acute, as if a veil was being gradually lifted from her perception. She could smell things she had never noticed before. The distinctive scents of different animals, the complex perfume of various flowering plants, even the subtle differences in the air currents that spoke of weather changes still hours away. "It's beginning," Darius observed, watching her with evident satisfaction. "Your heritage is responding to the proximity of others like yourself." "Others like myself," she repeated, testing the words. "How many of your people are there?" "In my territory alone, nearly 3,000. Across all the mountain clans, perhaps 10 times that number." His voice held quiet pride as he spoke of his people. "We have thrived in the places humans fear to tread. Built communities that live in harmony with the natural world rather than in opposition to it." The first settlement they reached took Isabella's breath away. It wasn't the crude collection of huts she had somehow expected, but a beautifully planned community that seemed to grow organically from the mountain landscape itself. Buildings were constructed from local stone and timber, their design following the natural contours of the terrain in ways that made them appear to be extensions of the earth itself. Children played in communal areas under the watchful eyes of adults whose casual alertness spoke of ingrained protective instincts. Gardens flourished in carefully tended plots that provided both food and medicine, while workshops produced goods with a quality and artistry that would have impressed the finest craftsmen in her father's kingdom. But it was the people themselves who captured her attention most completely. They moved with a fluid grace that echoed Darius's own predatory elegance, and when they looked at her, their eyes held depths that spoke of dual natures fully integrated. These were individuals who had never had to choose between their human intelligence and their wolf instincts, who lived as complete beings rather than fractured ones. "Welcome, Alpha," an elderly woman greeted Darius as they dismounted in the village center. "We are honored by your return." Her gaze shifted to Isabella with curiosity rather than suspicion, and Isabella found herself subjected to an evaluation that seemed to encompass far more than mere physical appearance. The woman's nostrils flared slightly, and Isabella realized she was being scented, assessed in ways that had nothing to do with visual observation. "She carries the bloodline," the woman announced with evident satisfaction. "Faint but true. The daughter of wolves finally come home." Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes unexpectedly. Home. When had anyone ever described her presence in such terms? At court, she had always been the princess who didn't quite fit, the royal daughter who preferred solitude to social events and books to political maneuvering. Here, she was being welcomed as someone who belonged, someone whose very existence was cause for celebration. The afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and experiences that challenged every assumption she had ever held about civilization and community. She watched children learning to track by scent, saw craftsmen whose enhanced senses allowed them to work with a precision that seemed almost supernatural, participated in a communal meal where the food was prepared with ingredients she couldn't identify, but which tasted like the very essence of the mountain wilderness. As evening approached and the moon began to rise, Isabella felt something stirring within her that was both foreign and familiar. It was as if a part of herself she had never known existed was slowly awakening, stretching muscles that had been dormant her entire life. "It's time," Darius said quietly, appearing at her elbow as she stood watching the moon climb above the mountain peaks. "Are you ready to meet your wolf?" The question should have terrified her. Instead, Isabella felt a sense of rightness so profound it made her dizzy. "What do I need to do?" "Nothing but trust," he replied, taking her hand and leading her to a clearing where other members of the community were already gathering. "Your wolf knows what to do. You just have to stop fighting her and let her emerge." Isabella found herself in the center of a circle of people whose eyes had begun to reflect the moonlight with an inner luminescence that spoke of approaching transformation. The air thrummed with energy that seemed to pulse in time with her own rapidly beating heart, and she felt something deep within her chest, answering that call with increasing urgency. "I'm scared," she whispered, though whether she was afraid of the transformation itself or of how much she wanted it to happen, she couldn't say. "Fear is natural," Darius assured her, his own eyes beginning to take on that golden glow that signaled his wolf rising to the surface. "But don't let it stop you from claiming what has always been yours." The transformation, when it began, was unlike anything Isabella could have imagined. There was no pain, no violent restructuring of bone and sinew. Instead, it felt like shedding clothes that had never fit properly, like taking the first deep breath after holding it for 22 years. Her human form dissolved like mist, replaced by something stronger, more graceful, infinitely more true to her essential nature. Her wolf was smaller than Darius's, but no less magnificent. Her coat a rich auburn that caught the moonlight and threw it back in shimmers of copper and gold. She felt power flowing through muscles designed for speed and endurance, experienced the world through senses that revealed layers of information her human mind had never been able to process. But most overwhelming of all was the sense of completeness, of finally being whole after a lifetime of existing as only half of what she was meant to be. Every restless moment of her human life suddenly made sense. Every feeling of displacement and disconnection explained by this revelation of her true nature. When Darius's wolf approached hers, she felt recognition so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth beneath her paws. This was her mate, her partner, the other half of a bond that had been forged long before they had met in human form. Their wolves circled each other in an ancient dance of courtship and acceptance, and Isabella understood with crystalline clarity that she had found her destiny. The pack run that followed was a revelation of joy and freedom unlike anything she had ever experienced. To move as one with dozens of other wolves across terrain that challenged and exhilarated, to communicate through scent and sound and subtle body language that conveyed meaning more precisely than words ever could, to be part of something larger than herself while remaining completely individual. When they finally returned to human form as dawn approached, Isabella felt fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond the physical transformation. She had tasted true freedom, experienced genuine belonging, and discovered strengths she had never known she possessed. "I can't go back," she said to Darius as they stood together, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. "I can't pretend to be only human anymore." His smile held triumph and tenderness in equal measure. "Then don't. Choose this life. Choose our people. Choose me." Isabella turned to face him fully, seeing her future reflected in his golden eyes. "I choose you," she said, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I choose this life, this world, this version of myself that I never knew existed." The mating ceremony that followed was unlike any wedding she had ever imagined. No elaborate gown or formal vows, but something infinitely more profound. Under the light of the setting moon, surrounded by their pack, they bound themselves to each other in ways that transcended mere legal contract or political alliance. When she returned to her father's castle weeks later to collect her belongings and formally abdicate her claim to the throne, Isabella barely recognized the woman she had been. The rejected princess who had fled the Great Hall in shame and humiliation was gone, replaced by someone who moved with predatory grace and whose green eyes held depths that spoke of wild places and ancient wisdom. Her father wept when she told him of her choice, though whether from grief or joy she couldn't tell. "You look happy," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "More alive than I have ever seen you." "I am alive," she replied, understanding the truth of those words in ways she never had before. "For the first time in my life, I am completely, authentically alive." The nobles who had witnessed her public rejection barely recognized her when she made her final appearance at court. Gone was the uncertain girl who had been found wanting by their political calculations. In her place stood a woman who radiated confidence and power, whose very presence commanded respect and attention. Prince Marcus, the last of her former suitors, approached her during the farewell reception with something that might have been regret in his eyes. "Your Highness," he began, his voice uncertain in a way it had never been during their courtship. "I wonder if I might have been too hasty in my previous assessment of your suitability as a queen." Isabella looked at him with the patience of a predator, secure in her dominance, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Weak, concerned more with appearances than substance, lacking the strength of character necessary to be a true partner rather than merely a political convenience. "Prince Marcus," she replied, her voice carrying an authority that made him step back involuntarily. "You were absolutely correct in your assessment. I would have made a terrible queen for someone like you. Fortunately, I was meant for something far greater than what you could have offered." As she walked away from him, from the court, from the life that had never truly been hers, Isabella felt the wolf within her stretching contentedly. She had chosen love over duty, authenticity over expectation, adventure over security. And in making that choice, she had discovered not just who she was meant to be, but who she had always been, waiting beneath the surface for the courage to emerge. The rejected princess was no more. In her place stood Isabella Blackthorn, alpha female of the Mountain Rose Pack, mate to the most powerful shapeshifter in the known world, and mistress of her own magnificent destiny. The girl who had once been found wanting by lesser men had become a woman who would be legendary among her own kind, remembered not for her humiliation, but for her courage in claiming the extraordinary life that had always been her birthright. And as she rode toward the mountains with her mate beside her and their pack ranging around them like living shadows, Isabella knew that her real story was just beginning.